Imagine millions of people suddenly on the move and two brand new governments trying to manage the entire thing with, well, just paper and ink. Let's dive right into this explainer of the 1950 agreement between India and Pakistan regarding migrants. We're looking at a truly defining moment in South Asian history. You have two newly independent nations staring down a massive, literally unprecedented humanitarian crisis, and they had to figure out how to navigate it. The document we're unpacking today is definitely not just a piece of paper. It's a profound blueprint. It shows us exactly how these governments attempted to legislate peace and manage the staggering logistics of human displacement after some incredibly severe communal disturbances. Just think about the historical weight of this moment. The actual signatures of Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru of India and Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan of Pakistan, signed on April 8, 1950, right in New Delhi. It really grounds this history for us. It's a stark reminder that at the very highest levels of power, these two leaders had to sit down, come together, and formally agree on a highly detailed step-by-step framework to restore order, protect minorities, and manage the flow of millions of incredibly vulnerable people. So, we're going to decode this treaty piece by piece through 5 critical themes. Number 1, guarantees for minorities. 2, the logistics of migration. 3, rights to immovable property. 4, justice after the disturbances. And finally, 5, enforcing the peace. Let's jump straight into Section 1, guarantees for minorities. This is really the core philosophy of Part A. Now, Part A of the document lays out this powerful, sweeping guarantee, complete equality of citizenship, irrespective of religion. Both governments solemnly agreed to ensure this equality for their minorities. And, that might sound like a basic fundamental right today, but think about the immediate fractured aftermath of 1947 and the violence that followed. Putting this explicitly into a bilateral treaty, that was a totally necessary anchor. It was a mutual declaration that a citizen is a citizen, period, no matter what they believe or how they worship. Both governments agreed to enforce these fundamental rights effectively, assuring them to all nationals without any distinction. And it wasn't just some vague promise of safety either. It explicitly protected life, culture, and property, fundamental rights we absolutely expect today, laid out as a literal lifeline back in 1950. It guaranteed freedom of movement and occupation, and crucially, it ensured equal opportunity for minority community members to hold political office, serve in the civil service, and even join the armed forces. We're talking about a comprehensive promise of integration and protection within their newly formed states. Moving right along to Section 2, the logistics of migration. This is where we see Part B and the real human scale of the crisis. This section specifically addresses migrants in the areas where the recent communal disturbances actually occurred, namely East Bengal, West Bengal, and Tripura. The text of the document reveals an immediate, desperate concern. The governments recognized people were on the move right then and there, and the goal was physically getting them across the border without harm. They needed immediate, state-sanctioned protection just to safely travel from one side to the other without fear. Now, the crucial point here is the strict, almost shocking limit, exactly 150 rupees. I mean, imagine packing up your entire life, everything you own, and the law states this is the absolute maximum cash you can carry across the border as an adult. It really highlights the immense economic control the states were attempting to maintain during what was essentially a chaotic mass exodus. And for each migrant child, that maximum cash limit was capped at just 75 rupees. When you hear these numbers, the treaty suddenly feels incredibly real, very human. It's no longer just a geopolitical negotiation. It's a strict mathematical formula applied to families fleeing their homes, dictating exactly what resources they were allowed to start their brand new lives with. Obviously, people had more than just cash, so migrants were explicitly granted the freedom to remove personal jewelry and household goods. But because of those strict wealth limits we just talked about, the treaty required that any excess cash or jewelry actually be deposited into a bank, and a proper receipt had to be furnished to the migrant. Plus, to make sure these highly vulnerable people weren't exploited when they were at their most defenseless, the agreement specifically ordered that there be no harassment by customs authorities. They even posted liaison officers at agreed-upon customs posts just to monitor the situation and make sure this practice was actually followed on the ground. All right, let's look at Section 3, rights to immovable property, and how they handled reclaiming land and homes. The document draws a very clear line between personal items you can carry, your movable property, and immovable property, things like land or houses. It boldly declares that ownership or occupancy rights of this immovable property shall remain entirely undisturbed. Basically, this meant that if a family fled in terror, legally speaking, their house or their farm still belonged to them. If someone else occupied it while they were gone, the treaty mandated that it absolutely must be returned to the original owner if they came back. To make this happen, the treaty established a hard, urgent deadline, December 31st, 1950. The governments were really trying to encourage people to return to their homes and restore some sense of normalcy. They promised that if a farmer or a tenant returned by the end of the year, their land would be restored to them. But if exceptional cases arose where the government simply couldn't return the property, say it was completely impossible, the matter was to be escalated to a minority commission for advice, and the government was legally required to take steps to rehabilitate the displaced migrant. But what about the people who realized they could just never go back? Well, for those who chose not to return, their ownership continued to vest in them. A legally empowered committee of trustees was actually established to help them recover rent or even sell the property. And this committee was highly specific. It had to consist of 3 representatives of the minority community, and it was presided over by a government representative acting as a trustee for the owner. It's a pretty remarkable administrative effort, honestly. The goal was to ensure that even if migrants lost their homes, they weren't entirely stripped of their previous livelihoods and generational wealth. They maintained an unrestricted right to dispose of their property. That brings us to Section 4, Justice After the Disturbances. Let's dig into Part C and D. These are the heavy, critical mandates both governments agreed to. This included setting up a dedicated agency to rescue abducted women and actively punishing those guilty of forced conversions. The text is very firm here. It actually mandates the creation of special courts where necessary to ensure swift punishment for criminal offenses against persons and property. It demands every possible effort to recover looted property. And regarding the severe trauma of the violence, it explicitly states that any conversion effected during a period of communal disturbance would automatically be deemed a forced conversion, strictly not recognized by the state, and the perpetrators would face real punishment. Furthermore, the agreement strictly prohibited any propaganda directed against the territorial integrity of the other country. They fully recognized the power of the media, what we might call fake news or dangerous propaganda today, so the treaty demanded prompt and effective steps to prevent the dissemination of mischievous opinion by the press, radio, or even just individuals. Basically, anyone inciting war or trying to rouse communal passion was going to be rigorously dealt with. The mandates laid out directly in the primary source text even included the creation of a commission of inquiry presided over by a high court judge. So this wasn't going to be some low-level, quick investigation. They wanted a formal commission to inquire at once into the causes and the full extent of the recent disturbances. The goal wasn't just pointing fingers and assigning blame, but making solid, actionable recommendations to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. And it was staffed in a way specifically meant to inspire absolute confidence among the minority communities. Finally, let's explore Section 5, Enforcing the Peace. We'll look at the bureaucracy and the minority commissions. As a direct step to rebuild trust, both governments agreed to depute 2 ministers to the affected areas and ensure minority representation within their own cabinets. Specifically, in places heavily impacted like East Bengal, West Bengal, and Assam, a representative of the minority community was to be included directly in the state cabinet. It was a clear structural attempt to ensure that minority voices weren't just being heard from the sidelines, but were actively part of the absolute highest levels of local executive decision-making. There was also a clear chain of command set up for dispute resolution, showing how local issues could escalate all the way up to the 2 prime ministers themselves. First, the minority commissions would observe and report on any breaches or neglect of the agreement. Then they'd submit their recommendations to both the provincial and central governments. Now, if the 2 central ministers couldn't agree on how to handle a recommendation, the matter didn't just die in some committee. No. It was mandated to be referred directly to the prime ministers of India and Pakistan so they could resolve it themselves, or determine an agency that would. Part F of the document meticulously dictates exactly how these minority commissions would be staffed. They had to maintain contact with minority boards all the way down to small administrative headquarters. Each commission was to be chaired by a provincial or state minister. And importantly, it included 1 representative from the majority community and 1 from the minority community, chosen right from their respective state legislatures. This was to ensure that the oversight body itself was perfectly balanced and had deep roots into the local districts to properly monitor the actual reality on the ground. So we've seen the sweeping philosophies of equality, the rigid math of 150 rupee travel allowance, and the highly complex mechanics of property rights and special courts. The 1950 agreement is truly a breathtaking attempt to write order into chaos, and it leaves us with this profound question. How successfully can a bureaucracy actually legislate peace during a massive humanitarian crisis? It's a challenge of history that absolutely continues to echo in global events today. Thanks so much for exploring this source with me, and keep questioning the mechanics of history.